Hello, this is MonteCristo, and I'm here with another team preview, this time with Mr. Hexagrams, an Overwatch analyst. As many of you are aware, I've seen him on many, many tournaments. Most recently, he was on the analyst desk for the Overwatch League preseason. So we are going to go over some teams together and give you a brief introduction to their styles, their players, everything like that. Of course, you can check out the rest of the series of all 12 teams on my YouTube channel. So this time we're going to be looking at the Shanghai Dragons. And this is an interesting team because it's an amalgamation of a bunch of Chinese players from former top Chinese teams, but maybe not necessarily the teams that were performing the best closest to the launch of the Overwatch League. And you were actually commentating the Chinese professional scene towards the end of the season, close to the launch of the Overwatch League. So you were in a unique position to give us insight on whether this is a good roster. Could they have made a better roster, perhaps, because that's been a lot of the controversy?
Yeah, well, it is partially a good roster. They took a lot of good players from one of the best teams. The two teams that were like the top two, then there was everybody else in OWPS was LGD and Miraculous Youngster. Now, obviously, people saw Miraculous Youngster play against the Korean teams, and they said, well, obviously, you just signed this whole roster. I don't think this roster is as good as it could be. But part of that is because there's a couple people on Miraculous or on LGD that they could have brought over that are not 18 yet. And they're 17 and they're not going to be 18 until next season. They can even come in through the break. Those players namely being Shy and Eileen. And I've talked about Shy a lot because I think this team needs a Zenyatta player, but he was the only big standout Zen in that region, so they can't have him. They could have built this roster a little bit better. And there's some players that I think we'll go through and we'll talk about each individual and who they could have been replaced with. But there are a lot of good players who straight up retired, straight up went to streaming. So on first glance, I was very critical of this team, but looking back on like the pool they had to draw from, I think they've done their best.
Yeah, and also when this team was getting assembled, a lot of that were players that we saw in the Shanghai stage of the World Cup with Five King and Undead, getting into it a little bit later. But this is a roster that didn't have spectacular preseason results. Now, part of that was they weren't able to scrim as a group in LA prior to the actual start of the preseason because two of their players were not even in LA until the night before preseason started. So we saw what was a team that was out of shape in terms of practicing in this meta, in this location against these teams. But there were some upsides. They made it closer than you might think in a 4-0 defeat to Seoul. But then they lost to Boston, a team that we didn't have a lot of hype for coming into the preseason. And yes, they did win a couple of maps. It did go to the 5th game, but they have been looking pretty disorganized as a unit.
Well, I think it's both things, that Shanghai is not as good as people thought they should be, and Boston's better than people thought they should be. That Seoul match was close, so there were a lot of bright spots in there. I think overall, you look at this team right now, and hopefully the practice is going to get them going because they need practice on certain support heroes, definitely. They're heroes that the supports they just don't play. These are not heroes in their pool. We're in a Mercy and Zenyatta pool right now, and none of the supports that they have on this roster are really super comfortable with it. I think they will adapt. But the bright spot I think we should maybe always open up with this team is that you don't want to take this team to a Widowmaker map because Dia, just based on pure aim, is top 5 in the entire league, I think. Just pure aim. Everything else out the window, but just aim.
Yeah,
it's
so
crazy.
Yeah, let's start by talking about Dia because a lot of players are not going, a lot of fans are not going to know about this guy. Now, you've casted a lot of this guy, and if you had watched the preseason, I encourage you to go back and take a look at some of the matches against Seoul because he is actually causing Fleta, the DPS on Seoul Dynasty, a lot of problems with that Widowmaker, just cutting him down time and time again. They were having such a hard time diving him because of his accuracy. It was actually insane. It was crazy to watch his mechanical skill.
And he was actually a player that was under accusations for the longest of times because he was that good. I mean, that's the ultimate compliment to someone who's not hacking, is to accuse him of being a cheater because his McCree was actually the hero he came up on, and he's that good on it. But I think he had the best Widowmaker performance of the entire preseason. He, of course, is the biggest bright spot on here. One of the first questions we always come up with Shanghai is, is Undead have a different enough pool from Dia to be able to help this team DPS wise? They only brought 2 pure DPS players in Dia and Undead. And Undead is a very fine McCree in his own right, but they have very similar hero pools, and it's all hit scan for the most part. They don't run a lot of projectile, so as not having a Genji or a Pharah going to hurt them. And mostly it's their best heroes. Both of them are probably McCree, Widow, and Tracer. And you are going to need a little more flexibility than that. I think Undead is a worse version of Dia at this point.
Yeah, and you have to say that even though he did perform, if you watch the World Cup matches in Shanghai, we did see a great Tracer performance from him. Yeah, there is that overlap, and like you say, they're coming in with only 2 DPS players, and they don't really have a true projectile player, which might come back to haunt them.
Right.
We did see when they could run double hit scan, they look okay, and even the synergy between the 2 DPS looks pretty good. But it is, I think, going to cause issues in the long term. So let's start with, let's go down and take a look at the main tank, because here's another opportunity we can look and say that they have just one main tank player. Is this going to be an issue in terms of diversity? But Roshan, their main tank, did play really quite well during the preseason. I was personally impressed with his game sense, his ability to know whether to attack the enemy backline or protect his DPS players. He was following Fleda's Genji around, saving his ult. Like he clearly had a very good knowledge of when to use his ultimates, which players to target. Target selection was excellent. So I feel like this guy, alongside Dia, is probably the biggest bright spot of this Shanghai roster.
He absolutely was. And he also played on a team with one of their supports, their most flex support, who goes by Free Feel now. He used to go by the name B612. So pretty much all these players who used to have numbers in their names had to switch them, thank God, because it's a nightmare to cast numbers in the name. It was Team FTD, which were like sitting on like the 3rd and 4th spot of most of the OWPS I covered. They were pretty good, actually. So I think he's going to work out really well if your flex support is going to be trying to support the dive on his Winston, if you beat a Zenyatta or even an Ana, because they work well together. But yeah, he was definitely the bright spot of this team outside of Dia. So it's not that there's no hope on this team. That core is really good. As you mentioned, he was a nightmare for some of the top tier Genjis in the world. They think they're away, and then Roshan's still in it. There was time and time again that he was bailing out of situations with like single digit HP almost as Winston and getting back and getting alive. And that helps his healers as well. So I think you're absolutely right that those are the 2 bright spots. And then it just becomes a matter of where's the second DPS, where's the flex tank fit in? And then I think, we should devote at least a couple minutes on the entire support situation.
Yeah, the support situation is really bad. We'll get there. So I didn't really have a lot of takeaways in my observations of their flex tanks, MG and what I've been told to say, what Zhusha is the proper way to say that. Still working on my Chinese pronunciation, but yeah. there wasn't a lot of meaningful difference between these 2 players for me. They were swapped out multiple times over the course of the series. They looked like mediocre diva players in my mind, but nothing really spectacular.
Mediocre diva players and almost non-existent Zarya players. This is going to be the biggest contention point for people who did follow the Chinese scene, because Miraculous Youngster, yes, there were players on the team that are too young and some of them got snubbed and moved on, but there was a player that I thought was the best player in all of China when I was watching it, and he was a flex tank by the name of Late Young. He played for Miraculous Youngster, and his diva was insanely good. He was always Johnny on the spot. Reminded me a lot of Matt's diva, cool Matt's diva, whereas you don't see him coming, and all of a sudden he just shuts someone's down and kills them, then he's back in the fight. Like this weird game sense assassin. But beyond that, his Zarya really flexed late on in the season too. So I think when people looked at this roster and noticed that there was no Miraculous Youngster, and moreover, there was no Late Young, who was just an absolute monster on flex, which is one of the more difficult positions in all of Overwatch to be a monster on and really show up huge in games. I think that's where people were really upset about it. Now, of course, who knows if they'll add someone in like that, but now with 2 flex tanks, you added a 3rd flex tank where he doesn't really offer anything beyond that. He really only played those 2 heroes. So I think that was the biggest surprise when people talk about Miraculous Youngster players not being on this roster, because Late Young is eligible, could have played, not here. And as you mentioned, there's really nothing to say about either MG or Zushu. They were okay, but you want more than okay, like even one big bright moment or something like that, and they just didn't really have it.
Yeah, and we might be seeing that later. And as okay as they were, now we get into the real dregs, the real problem that I think most of us, and you alluded to it earlier about the support situation, and they may not have the right players to actually deal with the Zen Mercy support duo that we saw that was so huge, such a huge part of the meta during the preseason. And I can say, my experience of watching and casting Five King was that he was a very good Lucio player, and he was a big part of the reason why we saw the Chinese Overwatch World Cup team go 12-0 in their group stage, right? They looked very dominant, actually, very coordinated. It was impressive to watch them, and he was a big part of that. But now that we're not in that Lucio meta anymore, what are we seeing with the altering Free Feel and Five King and this sort of grab bag of supports?
Well, you've heard me say it just outside of in our social lives. So like we're in a Mercy Zen meta, and they brought two Lucios and an Ana. Like there's just simply there's no way to get away from it. However, I was looking today. I'm like, which Zen could they have brought? And there was a player called Lando that came in late for the team, but then he retired. Shy, as I mentioned, is just too young to play, and there weren't a whole lot of other standout Zens. There's another Ana called Zhu Fanjun who was very good, but also I think overall, I think that Free Feel is going to be fine. He was on a decent roster, and I think if they run Ana, he'll be okay. He needs to work on his Zen for sure. I think he can be an okay flex support. I think Five King is in a little bit of trouble. I think he's kind of in that Verbo spot. If he's only going to play Lucio, you're only going to see him on the control maps.
Or
and
maybe Assault sometimes, maybe.
Maybe Assault sometimes. Then altering 130, another one of those numerical names. And he was on Team LGD, one of the best teams, and you see a lot of the players from the Shanghai roster from LGD. And he's been playing their Mercy lately, and that's really where they've been struggling. The problem is in the Chinese region, there were two teams that were very good, and it was Miraculous Youngster and LGD, and they were so good they didn't have to play Pharaoh Mercy. And everyone else was trying to play Pharaoh Mercy to catch up with them. So the problem is LGD was good enough that they never really had to play Mercy. So he has almost no experience on it. And if you look back at some of the mistakes and some of the fights that they've lost, it's simply being out of position for reses, not valking at the right time, stuff like that. Now, these Chinese teams have been very adaptable. And what I've seen over the 6 weeks that I cast OWPS, they will make changes and they will grind it out. But if you're looking for one weak spot right now, and it's terrible because it's Mercy in the Mercy meta, and it's just because altering, aka 130, just didn't play it a lot. And maybe they didn't get the time to scrim it. I would expect a better performance, but that's the first thing they have to fix if they want to get better.
So let's talk generally about the Chinese scene, because I think it does inform some of their play. So when you were casting OWPS earlier this summer, it was sort of like a meta bubble that was happening in China, where we saw significantly more Doomfist and McCree than we saw in other regions. So do you think, because we know that Shanghai Dragons were scrimming in China before they came over here, but weren't scrimming against the rest of the Overwatch League teams because of their issue getting their players in the night before the preseason. Do you think that this is a situation where now that they're exposed to more strategies, that they're going to adapt as we head into the regular season itself?
I think so. I think you used the correct term in bubble, and that's how we always describe it. And you'd see them running the meta, and it was so interesting because they know what the meta is, but they don't know why it is. So they would run dive and not dive with it. They're just like, well, these are the 6 heroes you play. This is the meta. And now I think you're going to see, since they are going to have a chance to scrim all these other teams and even maybe talk to them, that they will start understanding more of what the meta really is, what it means, and why it works that way, kind of a higher level strategy. And really in the Chinese scene, when you looked at the best teams, a lot of it was just based on mechanical skill, where they would totally screw something up, and then here comes Dion McCree and he kills 4, So a lot of it was kind of low-level strategy, and that really, I think, it held back a lot of the players and held back a lot of the teams because they didn't have to worry about it. They didn't have to worry about positioning and ultimate economies, essentially, or timings, because the players on the best teams were just better, and it was that easy most of the time. There was a lot of sloppy Overwatch in OWPS, if I'm being quite honest, fights never ended. People weren't able to finish off kills, whereas in high-level Overwatch, you see in the Korean and Western scene as well, I mean, fights are in, 2 or 3 things happen, and that's it. It's a reset. In China, they went on forever. I think it's going to benefit them a lot to be out of the bubble that was the Chinese scene, because a lot of it was just who can aim better and are they going to be able to play well. There was not a whole lot of consistent high-level strategy as far as going the meta and adjusting to it goes. But I think that these players are definitely capable of it. I think the mechanics on this team are probably pretty solid. And like I said, Five King could be very capable of shot calling on Lucio.
And this is also a team, we had an opportunity to talk to the coaching staff, and one of my big takeaways personally was that they seem very open to the idea of using the transfer window between stage 1 and the end of stage 2, at the end of stage 1, the end of stage 2, to acquire more players. And one of the advantages that we can say that Shanghai has is that almost certainly nobody is going to be attempting to sign Chinese players outside of
Yeah.
this. So they sort of have an exclusive market over the Chinese scene. And not only
Yeah.
that, but they potentially also have somewhat of an exclusive market over the Taiwanese scene because they're also Chinese speaking. And we have seen in other esports interregional movement between Taiwanese and Chinese teams before. So there's an enormous number of possible players that we could see this team picking up in the future. And when they only have 8 players right now, they could pick up
Right.
up to 4 more. So you've already mentioned Shy. You've mentioned some of these other players that are too young. Which players would you like? Like, is there a projectile DPS player from China that you think could really assist Undead and Dia?
I think Simfall could play it a little bit. He was playing a perhaps the Doomfist. I was going through some of these names, and a lot of them are too young, and a lot of them it just shows up as retired. I think the players they bring in are probably players that we maybe have not really seen before. Some of the other best DPS are also mostly hit scan specialists. Yang Zhao is a very good Soldier 76, which they don't necessarily have between D and Undead, but do you want to give another spot to just a pure hit scan? I mean, he pretty much only plays 76. There's a couple of Pharah Mercy combos. Most lower level teams would run a Pharah Mercy combo, but no one necessarily really stood out on that. They would all have days where they dumpster the other Pharah Mercy and then get dumpstered themselves. So there wasn't this great one, but I think Eileen would always be the guy I talk about bringing in, because not only can he run a Genji, I mean, his Doomfist was taking over fights for these teams, and he's got familiarity with the other DPS. And I think some of the best teams have DPS that have worked together, tanks that have worked together, supports that have worked together. I was really searching to try to find a Zen, and then Lando came in and played, and then it says Lando's, retired. So who knows? Maybe they can get these people out of retirement. You'd have to imagine that if someone's getting low numbers streaming PUBG, which I think a lot of them are doing, you bring them to a World Cup spot or, an Overwatch League spot, and they might unretire momentarily. So I think maybe not this year, but if they can start bringing in just like this massive, it's a massive talent shift, because Shy and Eileen, if they could both be on this roster would be competing with the best of them, in my opinion.
Yeah, and we saw Eileen as well with Undead, so we know that they have that synergy, looking at the Overwatch World Cup again, and he was a fantastic Genji player. So it does seem at least that they have some room for growth, but since we have to give people some idea of how this roster is going to do right as the season starts. Do we have high expectations? Because we've gone over the problems, right? They don't have the right support players for the current meta. We don't know if the meta is going to change before the start of the season, to be fair. They have limitations in terms of their DPS ability. Roshan's playing well, but they don't have any way to get another main tank in case something goes wrong. So what's our realistic, expectations for them? Like probably bottom 3?
Bottom 3 or bottom 4, I think is fair. I had them in my top, was like 6, and I've been completely wrong on that. Look, the thing is, when you look at a roster and then you're going through it, and even if there's only 6, 7 players, and you're like 2 of them are good, you're probably in trouble. Like, if you don't have a whole lot of positive things to say about the remainder of it, you can't really carry on just Widow and Winston play. It's not the world where that works out. So unless you see a drastic coming of age on just Mercy, or Mercy comes out of the meta for altering. But I still think right now we're living in a Zen world, and all the good teams have great Zens. And right now they don't really have someone who's really excelled at it. It wasn't all that popular in the region, or I mean, people would play it, but no one was standing out to the level that maybe even Shy or later on Lando were standing out. So maybe someone's in China now and they're grinding it out, but the current roster has a lot of problems with supports and flexes. And yes, there's flashy plays from Dia, but I mean, you play around a Widow. It's very possible to do so, and I don't think he can do it by himself. So probably bottom 4. I have him like 10 right now.
Okay, but still with a possible upside. This team is probably overall the hardest to get a read on out of all the teams that we have in Overwatch League, because of the fact that they came in so late, because of the fact that they were jet lagged when they played in the preseason, because of the fact that these guys are new teammates for each other. And because of the fact that we just haven't seen that much Chinese Overwatch as a whole, except for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I also think the bubble really hurt them. I think, not having other teams in this style which you play, like I said, man, if you watch the first 4 weeks of OWPS, I mean, God bless your heart, because it was hard to watch sometimes. There was some really sloppy play and some just rough Overwatch, and it got better as it went on, as teams started evolving strategies and they started showing a little more diversity. But I think they were stuck, and it's just like if you're having bad practice, then it's going to take a while to break those habits. If I'm being dead honest, I'd say that if you're a Shanghai fan, that season 2 might be the time to start wearing the hat. Maybe pick another
Yeah.
team for season 1.
Yeah, and also I assume we're going to have more Chinese teams come out in the future and the growth of the Chinese
Yeah.
scene overall. So it is just a bummer though, because earlier this year when we were watching that World Cup, it looked like there was going to be a really strong roster potentially coming out of China. So we know they could put together some good teams. It's just a little bit disappointing that this is the result, or at least it looked disappointing in the preseason. We will just have to wait and see if they, with actual like on-site practice, that developing that synergy, they can get something down and surprise us.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll know the way this builds and how everything goes once the like I said, Late Young was impressive. I think anyone who watched him play was very impressed by it. And maybe they just bring him in just to have another option somewhere out there, because he is eligible. He turned 18 in July, so they could have had him. Now, maybe he didn't want to play. Maybe Miraculous Youngster were hoping to get picked up as a team. There's a lot that went on with them, so it's really hard to read that situation. But the transfer window is going to tell us a lot. And if they can just kind of maybe stay afloat until then, they could surprise some people. It's possible. But I think season 2 is where you're going to see the more strength of the Shanghai team.
Yeah, I think that either this team is going to surprise us in the first stage, or we're going to see a lot more Chinese players signed, and they're going to start making some very interesting moves via their roster additions and changes that they'll make to the players that they want to field through their coaching staff. Okay, well, thanks a lot, guys. Be sure to watch for other videos in this Overwatch League preview series. This has been the Shanghai Dragons. Thank you very much, Hex.
Thank you.